This is tutorial 2 in the Java Web Application Development series. Today we're going to be walking through creating our database to store all of the data for our auction website. We'll be walking through configuring MySQL, the database schema, and all of the tables that go in there and building that out. We'll continue to flesh out the tables and the schema as we go on, but we will get started with that now. As we mentioned before, we are assuming that you have some familiarity with relational databases and SQL and concepts like that. We'll go through those briefly, but we'll not spend a lot of time on that. So we're assuming you've got some of that background already. We're going to be using MySQL as our database. There are a variety of different database servers: Oracle, SQL Server. MySQL is free, is relatively widely used for web applications, and the concepts are similar to any of the other database platforms like Oracle or SQL Server. So the knowledge here will transfer pretty easily from one platform to another. In the configuration instructions for this course, we did have instructions on how to install MySQL. So we're assuming that you already have MySQL installed on your server. And we also want to make sure when you install it, there is an option that says when you start the computer, automatically start MySQL. We hope that you have selected that so that MySQL is up and running on your machine every time you boot it up. There's a relatively easy way to check that, so we'll just make sure that our MySQL server is running now. It's a little bit different depending on if you're on Windows 7 or Windows 10. I'm on Windows 10, but either way, you're going to go to the settings. If you're on Windows 7, you will go to Administrator Tools, and then Services is what you're looking for. Here in Windows 10, we're just going to type Services, and there's an option here to View Local Services. So these are all of the services that are kind of running in the background on your machine. And we're going to look when we install MySQL, it installs a new MySQL service. As you can see, mine is up and running. If for some reason yours is not up and running, then you can simply right click on this and click start, and it will start the MySQL service. So since we've got MySQL up and running, we will move forward. I've got MySQL installed here on my local machine on C program files MySQL. The binaries for the server are here in MySQL Server 5.7. We're going to use MySQL Workbench as our tool to kind of see and create our database schema. You go to that directory, you can see there's an executable, MySQL Workbench executable. You can pin this to your taskbar. We'll be using it relatively frequently, so if you want to go ahead and pin it to your taskbar, you can do that. In any case, we're going to go ahead and launch MySQL Workbench. Now, the cool thing about MySQL Workbench is that you are able to use it. I've got a connection already created. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. You can use MySQL Workbench to connect to a MySQL server on your local machine, or you can use the Workbench to connect to a MySQL instance on another machine. When we deploy our application out to the web and we have an ISP that's hosting it, we can use MySQL to connect to our server remotely. So it's a great tool for both local development as well as debugging and testing and things like that remotely. So when we come in here, we don't have any connections set up yet. We'll click on this little plus, and this will pop up a window that will allow us to connect to a MySQL server. I'm going to call this localhost because we're going to connect to the MySQL instance on my local machine. The host name is 127.0.0.1. We're going to connect as root. When you install MySQL, you specify a password. I hope you've noted that. You're going to have to enter it here to connect. Now, we'll see in a moment, you can have a single MySQL server that has several schemas, several different databases, if you will, on that server. So if you're doing web application development and you are developing 3 or 4 different applications at the same time, a single MySQL server instance can host all of those. If you want this connection to automatically connect to one of those schemas, you can specify that here. We're going to go ahead and leave it blank. I'm going to go ahead and test our connection first, and it's going to ask me for my password. I'm going to go ahead and save it in the vault so it does not ask me every time. And it says we are able to successfully connect. And so we'll say OK. So we've got our connection to our local MySQL server here. I'm going to double click on that, and you will see our workbench will open up. This workbench will show us everything that's going on with our MySQL server here on our local machine. So we have, you can see the different schemas here. There's a system schema that's created for us when we install. There are options over here on the left. You can see the status of your server, who's connected to it, what users there are. Right now, I think there's just a root user. Yep, and a system user that gets created by default. But a lot of options for managing your MySQL server over here. We are going to now create a new schema on this server. I can either right click down here in the schema and say create schema, or there's a little icon up here. I'm going to push the create schema button here, and this is our auction site. So we're going to call this auction site. The collation is how are the characters in the database stored. Server default is probably fine. I'm going to go ahead and go through here. Different schemas allow you to search through the data in your database more efficiently, or you can trade off a more robust search for a faster search and things like that. You can do a little research on your own on collations if you want to. We are going to use, I would recommend either using UTF-8 default collation or the UTF-8 Unicode. Unicode is going to be a little bit slower, but a more accurate search. In our case, it's not going to matter that much, so I'm just going to go ahead and use the UTF-8 default collation. So we'd say apply. And basically, what MySQL Workbench does for you is you do these tools, and then it generates the SQL to do what we're asking it to do. So we're going to create a new schema called auction site with this character set. So we'll hit apply, and now we have a new schema. And I'm going to close this out. So here's our auction site database. Here we've got tables, views, stored procedures, and functions. What we're interested in at this point is tables. We are going to configure some basic tables for our auction site. The tables that we're going to create initially are a user table that will contain, when you register as a new user, you'll create a username and a password. So this will manage, people logging in and out of the site. We'll create a product table that will list and hold all of the products that are up for auction on the site. We'll create a photo table that will contain information about pictures that are uploaded to the site for a product. And we'll create a bid table that will handle all of the bids on a particular product. So let's start. We're just going to create the basics of these tables now, and we'll flesh them out later as we go. But want to just get started here. I'm going to right click on tables, and we'll say create table. And we'll pull up a little form for us. The first table that we're going to create is user. And it's going into the auction site schema, which is what we want. And now we get to specify our columns. So if you just click on the first column, the first thing that we need is a unique ID for each user. This is usually an integer value, and as a matter of fact, MySQL creates it for you by default. If you just click in here in the column name, you can see that it's going to try and create a column for us called ID user, which is great. It's an integer. It is the primary key for our table, and it is not nullable. We must have a value for that. So with all of the tables that we create, we want to have a unique primary key field. And the nice thing is MySQL Workbench makes it very easy to set that up. The only other two columns that we need right now are the username and the password. So I just click down here in the next line, and it comes up, gives us a user column. I'm going to call this username. It's a varchar field, 45 characters wide. That's fine for us for now. We're going to basically say that this cannot be null. You must provide a username, and the username must be unique. We don't want multiple people on our site with the same username. And then I'm going to click down here in this empty column, and we're going to create a password. Oops, double click here, and I'm going to click in password. Again, this is a varchar field, which is fine, and we're going to say it is not nullable. So that's all we need for right now. And so if we hit apply, MySQL is going to again generate the SQL to create this table for us. Create table auction site.user. Here are the columns. The primary key is ID user, and there's this one unique index on it. So if we hit apply, it created that table, and we look here, we now have a user table. So we'll move through quickly here, and we're going to create next a product table. This is going to hold our products. So click here. If you double click in there, it says ID product integer. It'll automatically check these for you. Primary key, not nullable. That's great. We need to have a product name for this product. Oops. It's a varchar field. We're going to make it 80 characters wide. And we're going to say this is not nullable. You've got to have a product name. Then we'll put in a description field. We're going to make the description field a little bit bigger. We'll say 500 characters for now. And we can make this optional. I'm not going to check this box, which means you can leave it blank if you want to. Then I'm going to put in a couple of date time fields. I'm going to put in listing start. So when was this auction put up for sale? I'm going to click on this little drop down here. These are all of the different kind of data types that we have available to us in MySQL. And I am going to use a date time field here. We want to make sure that we have, oops, sorry about that. Oops, I'm going to put in a date field for now. And then the listing end is also a date field. And not nullable. So those are our basic fields for our product. And so we'll apply that. We should be all set. We now have our product table. We're going to move on now to when you list a product, we're going to allow the user to upload multiple photos for that product. So I'm going to create a new photo table. And so again, we need our ID photo, which is our primary key. I'm going to put in a photo number. That's another integer field. So we'll know, we can kind of keep track of the order of photos, for the order the user wants them listed, something like that. And then we also need to have a file path. This is going to be a path, and I'm going to make this 80 characters wide, and this is not nullable. So this is a path to where the file is stored on our server. Finally, we need to know what product this photo is for. So we're going to create a foreign key. So I'm going to put in here ID product, and that is an integer. And it is not nullable. So we are going to, for every photo that we upload, we're going to refer back to the product table and uh, and store the information here in this table about what product this is for. Um, so we're going to go down here to this foreign keys section. This allows us to link basically from link one table to another table in our database. So what am I going to call this foreign key name? I'm going to call it FK photo. I'll do it. Photo product. We're going to reference the product table. What column are we going to reference in the product table? We're going to reference, or what, sorry, what column here in the photo table are we using for this foreign key? We're using ID product. And what column are we referencing in the product table? Also ID product. Now, a couple of cool things you can do with foreign keys. I'm going to say on update, I'm not going to do anything. So if you update the product table, what should we do? I'm going to say nothing. However, if we delete the product from our database, if we get rid of it, if somebody says, I'm done with this product, I'm going to delete it or whatever, I'm going to say undelete cascade. And what that will do is basically it will delete, if you delete the product, it will delete any photos that are associated with that product. I may actually change that later because there is some back-end work we want to do to make sure that we get rid of the files in the background as well. But for now, we'll do delete cascade. So I'm going to hit apply. And here it is a little bit more in depth, creating our table here. And we've got our foreign key constraint referencing ID auction site product, this field on delete cascade. So I'm going to hit apply. And we have our photo table. One last table quickly, we'll go through this quickly, is the bid table. So when somebody wants to bid on this product, oops. All right, we need a ID bid, that's our primary key. We need to reference the product that they're bidding on, which is ID product. That is an integer field. And we also need to know who is making this bid, ID user. And that's going to reference our user table. That's an integer as well. And finally, we want to know the bid amount. I'm going to store that as a decimal, call it 8, 2, which gives us 2 places after the decimal point. That is not nullable. And now let's go ahead and set up our foreign keys that will point back to the product table and the user table. So our first foreign key name is FK bid product. It's referencing the product table. So we're going to use this column in the table, and we're going to reference the ID product column in the product table. On delete, again, we're going to cascade. Great. And then I'm going to click over here. We're going to create one more. There's a foreign key bid user. So we're going to reference the user table. We're going to use this column. Oops, sorry, the ID user column, my bad. There we go. And we're using ID user here. And again, if we delete the user, we want to delete any bids that they have made. So those are all of our tables. We'll apply that. Here's our SQL. And there we go. And at this point, we have at least the beginnings of our database. This is up and running. And one last thing that we want to show you, sometimes it's helpful to be able to create a build script rather than go in and do all of this in the MySQL Workbench UI. Once we've done this, when we deploy this, we may, or if we need to reinstall our database, we may want to have a build script that builds all of the tables in our database for us automatically. I'm going to show you how to do that quickly in MySQL Workbench. If we go to Database and click on Reverse Engineer, we're gonna use our localhost connection, And we're going to go here. So we have to connect first to our database server. And we want to reverse engineer this schema. So it's going through and it just looked at that schema and said, oh, there's four objects here in this schema. And now what it does is it creates this ER diagram, entity relationship diagram. So basically it kind of gives us a graphical view, and this really is what's happening. We've got our product table, our bid table that's referencing we've got our product table. The photo table has a many-to-one relationship with that. Our bid table has a many-to-one relationship with our product, and our bid table has a many-to-one relationship with our user table. If you're not familiar with ER diagrams, you can do a little bit more research and look up how those work, but it basically tells you how the tables are linked and if it's a one-to-one or a many-to-one or a many-to-many relationship. So once we've reverse engineered, sometimes it's just helpful to get a visual picture of our database. Now we can actually forward engineer this. So it's going to take this ER diagram and create an SQL script for us. So we'll go here. I'm going to click this one box that basically says if we're creating our database, if we've already created a table, I want to drop that table and recreate it. I actually want to drop the schema. Actually, I won't do that for now. I'm going to assume that the schema has been created. So we're going to export these four objects. And here is basically the database script to create this table, this database from scratch. I'm going to save this to a file. I'm just going to put it on my desktop for now. And we'll call this auction site. .sql. So if I ever need to regenerate my database for some reason, it's right there. So that is the basics of how we create our database schema in MySQL. And with the next tutorial, we will start to build the front end to connect to the database and either save or retrieve data from these tables that we've just created.